Yeah. All right, folks, I think we're going to get started. Welcome to the Tuesday LACIS Lunchtime Lectures. I love the alliteration in that. So fun to say. I am Sarah McKinnon, for those of you who don't know me or we haven't met yet, and I'm the faculty director of LACIS this year and for years to come. And it is my pleasure to introduce one of our Tinker professors this semester, Professor Jesus Arroyave, who is a Tinker professor, but his own department is a Department of Communication in Universidad del Norte. Yeah, he will be chatting with us, speaking with us about Colombia media and its contributions to war and peace. And I am so excited to hear this talk today. So thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you for coming. Today we're going to share some of the findings of a project that I've been working for the last 3 years. It's a project that was awarded with Alexander von Humboldt Scholarship. And I spent almost 2 years there in Germany researching this topic, conflict media coverage. So the role of media in order to cover any conflict. And then I tried to focus on the research in Colombia. And when I came back to Colombia, I started working on fieldwork. And I explored in different ways, the quantitative approach, the qualitative approach, and also with the previous research in Germany in regard to analyzing the literature. So what I'm going to do today is to share some of the findings of those projects, of that particular project, and try to illustrate some people role played in regard to some of the other conflicts. So here's just some things about the conflicts. We have here the background explained for the idea to provide some context before starting talking about the issue. Colombian people, we Colombian people, have been facing this terrible war for more than 60 years, right? This is a huge problem because 9 million victims. Colombia has around 50 million inhabitants. So 1 in 5 are the victims of this conflict. And in regard to killing, it's terrible.
Sorry, I'm
to report these 450,000 people have been killed in this war. Colombia is the country in the world with the largest internal displacement because of the war. And also, just information, general information. What is important to clarify is that although the peace agreement was signed in 2016, we are still struggling with so many problems. For instance, with regard to community leaders, although 1,200 community leaders killed in the last 4 years, 5 years, and also ex-fighters. Those who signed the agreement, nowadays we're talking about more than 350 ex-fighters have been killed. No matter that they signed the agreement, that they went back to the civil society, and still they were targeted by different actors of the conflict. And still, there are active more than 5,000 members of PARC, which they are considered dissident because they decided not to be part of that agreement. So still, we're facing so many issues, and it's a huge problem there in our country. And the media is the ones that is the way that we learn what happened, right, in regard to the conflicts. But it's also, the media is facing so many problems there in Colombia because the guerrilla groups, but also the paramilitary groups, but also the drug cartels, but also the corrupt government officials target the media as a way to sometimes avoid that key information spread in the country. And you can see here some facts about what happened with the media, attacks to the freedom of press, people killed. We're talking about more than 163, some figures, like the Centro de Memoria Histórica told about 152. But what is problematic about those killings is that almost 80% are impunity. So nowadays, so we just know around 22% of those who
kill those journalists, but what we know is the person who perpetrated the crime, but we know who paid that hitman in order to fulfill that issue. So we're talking about just the perpetrator, but not the real intellectual force behind that crime. So here is an ecosystem that is stable because we have important newscast channels, radio networks, important newspaper, but to be journalists is really a challenge there in Colombia. And since we're talking about conflicts, according to Galton, the violence is a consequence when we are not able to solve the conflicts. So a conflict is good because it's always a way to change something, right? But the ideal situation is how can we handle that conflict in order to surpass and to avoid like interaction using violence. But there in Colombia, and also this is just context information, but facts, specific key information. We're talking about a country that is the second most unequal country in Latin America. And in regard to land distribution, which is at the roots of the conflict there in Colombia, we are also the second highest, more unequal country in regard to land distribution in Colombia, in the continent, in Latin America. And also when we cite the Gini coefficients, it's also another problem there in regard to inequalities. And this is also problematic when we're talking about strata. There in Colombia, every neighborhood has a number, and the number is an strata. And that means that just to say your neighborhood, the people immediately identify if you are strata 1, strata 2, and that implies that you are poor. Because there are 6 strata, the richest people live in 6, number 6, the upper middle class 5, and then you go down. Just the 1 and 2 and 3 are the poor. But we're talking about 90% of the population living in 1, 2, and 3 strata. And just there is a lot of social discrimination with this system to identify every neighborhood according to the strata. And also in regard to mobility, vertical mobility is really hard, really difficult there. And there are studies, some sociological studies that sometimes to improve, to change in a lifetime is so complicated. So what I try to illustrate with those ideas is that sometimes those conflicts, when they don't find ways to try to solve it, generate violence. And here, this is what we face. Many Colombians there, most of the time when we watch TV newscasts, listen to radio news stations, and that was one of my key motivations to explore this topic, because most of the time when we turn up our television during lunchtime or during dinner time, most of the diet that we were exposed in those news medias were massacre, violence. Sometimes the headlines, you see, it's terrible. The pictures were really strong. And those are the most important newspapers in different regions at some point. And so the kind of information that we were exposed for a long time was violence. So the question was, how can we change that? There is a way to perhaps, okay, there are facts related to the conflict, but there is other ways to try to explore, to share that information, or to explore venues that perhaps contribute not just to increase, to exacerbate the war, but to try to find path to the peace. So the media, it is possible to do it. As you can see here, when I started exploring this issue there in Germany, reading the literature about, I found that, yeah, there are a lot of empirical studies that prove that it's possible to exacerbate the conflict through the media. But at the same time, it is possible the opposite, to find ways to contribute to the peace. And you find here some key studies that prove that was possible to solve, to contribute to this path to the peace. So one of the main authors in regard to conflict study was Galton. Galton is a Norwegian researcher that have been working for the last 60 years. And as early as 1965, he published a key article in which he identified ways in which it is possible to explore that venue that I mentioned in regard to peace journalism. He said, yes, after analyzing so many conflicts in so many parts of the world, Galton's come up with this dichotomic approach in which it is possible to cover the conflict by using war journalism or by using peace journalism. So the main theoretical assumption of Galton is that there is a way to improve, to facilitate, to contribute to the peace through this approach that he called peace journalism. And basically, the table was presented as an intellectual elaboration in 1998. And basically, in this century, there's a lot of research in regard to using Galton's theoretical approach to explore conflict all over the world. And you can see here some studies in Pakistan, in Cyprus, in Ireland. Most of them use this Galton approach. And the peace journalism, according to this theoretical perspective, is that the journalists have a specific target in regard to avoid that objectivism. No, he's subjective, but in pro of the peace agreement. For instance, adopting a practice for peace approach, minimizing cultural differences, promoting peaceful conflict resolution, try to identify long-term effects, not just immediate effects or action, avoid these, provide just information that is through the elites, and include the ordinary people as a source of information, using precise language, avoid emotional charge, and avoid this dualistic or simplistic view of the reality. So those are the features that Galton defined after a long research that identify the way that media can contribute to peace. And here, just to identify that most of the studies use Galton's approach, and just a few of them have a different path. And this is part of the table that we were, constructing there in Germany in regard to the literature. But here you have the complete Galton's proposal, the theoretical proposal. As I mentioned, he is a dichotomic prescriptive approach in which, for one side, you have the characteristic of the feature that define that kind of media coverage that define war. And on the other side, the specific one that concentrate in peace journalism. So what is the idea of this study? By using this theoretical approach to explore what happened there in Colombia. If, for instance, what is the kind of coverage that we can identify according to findings of previous studies, according to the interview done with some journalists, according to the survey that I mentioned that I did. So here, let's just start with what I did was, as I mentioned, quantitative study and qualitative study. In regard to the quantitative study, I used survey and I explored with the journalists what happened, what their conception about news, and I used those categories to explore how they feel in regard to which of those they identified the most. And in regard to focus group, I went to different newsroom, newspaper, television, regional television network, national television network, and I talked to journalists in a place like this, exploring their perception about the conflict and the way that they approach the news related to this issue. And also, I did face-to-face interview with key journalists, senior journalists, and they provide me also key findings, key information in order to understand that. And at the same time, previous to that, I was exploring key literature in order to have a better understanding of the issue and also to identify categories, variables, key information then that was important when I, after that, use it in those interviews, in those focus groups, and in the survey. So in regard to the first just to, you remember here, presentation of the conflict is one of the main category. Conflict actor is the second one, and language is the third one. So we're going to start with this first one, presentation of the conflict, and we're going to identify some findings that I come up with this project. So as I mentioned, here now is one feature of war journalism. And what is the idea of here now? Basically, to provide superficial, straightforward information about something that happened related to the conflict. Okay? Just how many people were killed, how many buildings were destroyed, but just facts, just typical information. And with that information, you learn issues, but you never go deeper to understand the causes and the consequences of the conflict. What is the motivation of those actors behind that particular action? What is the roots of the problem? How can we go deeper into the issue that caused the problem in order to solve it? This is the ideal peace journalism, okay? But the common war journalism is this, just fact, just superficial information. So here in the literature that I reviewed, this is one of the most important projects that took place there in Colombia, Antonio Nariño project, okay? And researcher there in Colombia started analyzing the most important newspaper, 12 important newspapers in key cities in Colombia. And they found, after analyzing more than 3,000 journalistic pieces news, that 90% of the stories focuses on the frame, the way that they presented was basically news or brief mixer. So just information that we can characterize as a here and now. Superficial, not profound information, just what happened, but not beyond that information. And as what I said, when they try to find ways in which perhaps there is a contextual, more profound information, just 6% they found in those more than 3,000 news pieces in 12 most important newspapers in Colombia. Okay? So with this finding, I went to different places, newspapers, radio stations, and I start asking journalists, it is possible to explore, to go beyond the news and to provide more deep information? And this senior journalist in Región Cafetera, the coffee region in Colombia, Manizales, one of the most important newspapers, he told me, well, if I want to do something extra, more than news, I have to do it in my free time. Because the newspaper, the director, the editor, they ask me just for news, just straightforward, direct news, but not any profound genre. In journalism, when we're talking about different genre, you know, news is straightforward information, but chronicle are just history is include more deep information, and it's always several pages with great information. And also what we call reportaje, which in English is news features, is also considered a major genre in journalism. So that means that in that area, the finding was that it was no way to provide deep information about issues that were related to conflict or other news, because the perception of the owner and the editor was just concentrating news. And similar finding happens in Monteria, Córdoba, which is another city in the Caribbean coast in Colombia. These journalists who work in RCN, which is one of the most important radio network in Colombia, told me that he was so busy doing his job the whole time that was just have enough time for produce news. When they tried main genres, most important one, basically, also the newscasts there said, no, just concentrate news. We don't want anything different. So this is newspaper, this is radio, and now television. And there was a focus group that we have there in Medellin, in Antioquia. And I clearly recall this journalist when he told me that he used to work to a important national network, television network. And the headquarters in Bogota, in the capital, asked him just to look for conflict, but in a specific, like a killing, like a spectacular image. And what it was at the end, this expression that the information that they were asking was for blood. So not just through content analysis, but also through the interviews, we start identifying that more than often, this idea to go deeper and try to explain in a really profound manner what is going on in regard to the conflict sometimes is absent in many news media. And here, this is the finding in regard to the survey. And as you see, in regard to war journalism, the first feature is to report on civilian casualties, to report material damage, and also to focus on here and now. So those features that are also related to war journalism were emerged as important in the quantitative data. And this is another finding in regard to the content analysis, the previous study. When we're talking about falsos positivos, false positive, which is a euphemistic way to call for extrajudicial assassination. There in Colombia, more than 6,400 young people, most of the time, were killed by the army, and they were presented as the idea was to present it as a member of the FARC, the guerrilla FARC, okay? Because during Álvaro Uribe's government, there was this enormous pressure to present results. So the idea was that we need results, okay? So many of those generals that were at some point leading important commands in different regions, there was so enormous pressure to find ways to kill the enemy, that was the guerrilla. So since there was no way to do it, they killed innocent people. And they show it as they were member of the guerrilla. And what is worse is that not just killed it, but they were rewarded with money and day off because there was the incentive. There was basically as a way to achieve that goal. So what happened with this so important news is that as Rodriguez, there was a wonderful piece of research, analyzed most of the news related to that falsos positivos. And she found that most of the time, the information was provided in an uncritical and discontextualized manner. But what is worse, the main source of information was the government official and the army, which of course, the kind of information that they provide was according to the interest of the army and the government, and to preserve the image, right? To most of the time, to avoid the accept responsibility that was a crime and not, and people that was not related to the war. So this is another key that in certain way allows to think that no matter that we're talking about some issues that sometimes are complicated, are terrible in a war, the way that the people learn through news media were in a really uncritical and poor sources that tends to hide information that was important, okay? And if we just not go to what happened with journalists, but the media system there. Here, this is a study about what are the most important newspapers that are consumed there in Colombia. And as you can see here, Que Hubo is one of the most important ones and has like a specific newspaper for the main important city. Not in Barranquilla, as you see, Medellin, Cali, Bogotá, Cartagena. But what happened in Barranquilla? In Barranquilla, there is Al Día. And Al Día belongs to El Heraldo, which is the most important newspaper. So what happened is that it was impossible for Que Hubo to defeat Al Día, but Al Día is the same sensationalistic way of approach the news. As you can see here, this is the kind of information that we're going to find in those newspapers. A lot of graphic, a lot of pictures, dramatic information. And you can see here, it's talking about a raper, and you see the face of the raper, right? Here, most of the time, pictures with people killed. So in those newspapers that are consumed as the most important, one of the most important there, it is almost impossible to find profound pieces. Most of the time, it's just news, just superficial news, but not like a really chronicle. As a matter of fact, none of them have chronicle, none of them have feature writing, reportage, just short information, pictures, graphic, and is most of the time what happened there. But now, and this is was last year, this is an important research that has been done there in Colombia in regard to what is the kind of media that people, the young people, but in general, the population is consumed. And as you notice, the higher figures, 50%, instant messaging, 44% social networks. Where do we consume those kind of information? In the cell phone, right? Who's going to read a chronicle of 5 pages in the cell phone? Who's going to read a really in-depth reportage or news feature in applications such as WhatsApp, or perhaps Facebook, or perhaps Instagram? So what is also another concern in regard to this finding is that the most important print newspaper and print magazines, most of the people said that almost 30% said that they never read it. So they basically learn about what's happened by most of the time, those kind of information that came in the cell phone. And here is 2020 is the Reuters Digital, which is a really an important source of information. And also when those traditional newspaper have the new digital version, still Que Hubo is consumed 21%. ADN, which is another tabloid, although not just focused on crime, but also superficial information, 24%. But El Espectador, which is one of the most prestigious and important newspaper there in Colombia, just 4%. And El Tiempo, 60%. So what I try to prove here is that in traditional newspaper, but also in now digital platform, sometimes what the people consume the most are those kind of newspapers or media outlets that perhaps they don't concentrate and provide really in-depth information. Most of the time, just superficial information. And if we go back to Galton's table, theoretical model, we're not talking about peace journalism. We're talking about war journalism, because there is no way for the people to have a really clear understanding about the conflict if they don't really have the fact, but not just the superficial fact, but the roots of the problem. So according to this finding, it's complicated that just the mainstream news media that is sensationalistic, and you see all the places, all the cities, one of the most important newspapers is the one that provide the information. And you know what is worse? Let me see if I can take up the information here. Sometimes those same newspaper Que Hubo belongs to the same newspaper that are the traditional one. So what they did there in Colombia was, for instance, Vanguardia Liberal o El Colombiano in Medellín or in Bucaramanga. they create Que Hubo Bucaramanga in a partnership to for one side, provide the traditional newspaper to the city, but on the other side, to have the sensationalistic approach that is consumed the most. So in this way, the same editorial house get money from both kind of information, no matter that it's not something really ethical, right? But for them, it's a business, and that's it. And another idea that I would like to emphasize is that when we're talking about those social leaders that were killed, in the other slide, we were talking about 1200. In this one, this is Centro de Memoria Histórica, historical center, memorial center for history. They provide this information about how many leaders have been killed in the last 4 or 5 years, 6 years. But what happened in most of the newspapers and the media is that we have the news that that particular leader was killed. But most of the time, the reason behind is not provided. Why? Because in certain region, there's a kind of association between those criminal groups and political leaders. And for a journalist, it's really dangerous to go there and to try to go deeper, because it's hard, it's complicated. And you know, since we're talking about more than 163 journalists killed, so that means that this situation is just, we know that he or she was killed, but we ignore what was the main reason why they tried to avoid that this leader voiced their opinion about an issue that he was fighting in the community. Then I guess we have time for mention a second important category, actors, and in particular, according to war journalism, when the information that is provided focuses on elite, that means that this is typical of war journalism approach. But when we gave voice, the media allows, you know, people from the community, leaders, to be part of the source of information. This is peace journalism. And there in Colombia, also, we're talking about Rey y Bonilla, another important study. And they said that when explored print, television, and radio media, most of the time, the main source of information was the official one. Tamayo, which is a well-known scholar in regard to media violence and conflict, he also found that in 4,000 journalistic pieces, the only source of information was the military and the government. So this is complicated because, as many analysts have mentioned, this is the way to narrate the conflict, but from the official voice, from one actor that have interest. So most of the time, those newspapers, the radio station follow this logic to rely on the official source. And here, as you notice, we're talking about opinion journalism, which is supposed to be independent, right? But also in opinion journalism, most of the time, 50% of the sources that they use is the official one. And we just not analyze the specific, but also the system, as we did with the previous category. As you can see here, those are the tycoons, the richest guys there in Colombia. Luis Sarmiento Angulo, Ardila Lule, he's dead right now, but the family is the owner of those important news media, the Santo Domingo, and also the Gilinski, which is the owner of Semana. So what happened is that in this moment, the richest tycoons, they are the owner, that you can count here, the most important media outlet to a general, not just news, but also entertainment, but also television, but also radio. RCN is not just television, but also have music, entertainment network, news network, etc. Sarmiento in Santo Domingo, also the owner of Caracol, which is the most important network. El Espectador is now the owner of Santo Domingo family. So what happened? This is what happened. That sometimes those media that belongs to the elite, in particular to the richest people there, try to protect the interests. And the way that they present the information is not really neutral. It's not the best way to do it. It's basically as a way to protect, as a way to make sure that the economical interests are the most important one. You can see here, those covers, it's not information, it's more propaganda in a certain way. It's manipulation. For instance, this particular cover was when there was the most important election, because that was the first time in the history that a leftist candidate had the possibility to be elected as a president, Petro. So the cover was, what do you prefer? Un exguerrillero, ex-guerrilla man, or an engineer? So it was clear that just because of the cover, the information, the manipulation was clear. And here, Petro, and you see Putin and the other Palestine. So they're talking about the Muppet, right? The teacher. Mm-hmm. So that's implied that most of the time, the information that basically the people receive in important magazines such as Semana, but also in newscast like RCN. And there's a lot of research about RCN because in particular, Ardila Lule and his organization was against of the agreement. And it was usual there that when you watch RCN newscasts, they split the screen of the television in two, in which in one side you have the people there in La Habana talking about the conflict, and in the other side they present image about the war 20-25 years ago, about the guerrilla attacking a particular commando, like an army command, a special place, in uncontextual manner, because that was information that was more than 15 years ago. So in the way that they presented the information in RCN, it was clear that it was against of the agreement. And they said, those are the ones that are negotiating today, but they were the killer 20 years ago. So basically, what we find here is that most of the time, the information that is provided fulfill the ideal of peace journalism. And more than often, this ideal situation to narrate the conflicts using different voices is not really what happened. So in order to finish this part of the presentation, since there are just some findings, because there's more information, and we have been working on all the different categories, analyzing what happened there. Here are some of the final remarks in regard to this finding. For instance, in regard to the literature that we review previous studies, basically the logic of media production, that it's a business. And as a business, they need to really compete with other different newscasts or different newspaper or different radio station. And as a business, they need to sometimes to attract the audience. And the war is a magnet, especially because of the image, the kind of information that they provide. So sometimes, because of this logic of the market, what we're going to see in many news pieces is this dramatic way to present the information, as we review in some covers of important newspapers. So, but in doing so, the issue is that, okay, you're providing this sensationalistic, this spectacular information, but what is happening with the role of media to educate, to help to really inform citizens, to create this famous public sphere, that the people learn what happened in order for them to decide, and perhaps to try to support ideas that try to find solution of the conflict. So we see in some studies and in the findings of some previous analysis, most of the time is here and now approach in which the information is superficial, the information is not deep, and the way that the new ecosystem in which that issue of social media or messaging is almost impossible to really learn in a deep way about the conflict. And you see here some key authors that they mentioned that because the war is as a news value is attractive, sometimes they prefer to present it in a dark way and not to explore the peace journalist approach. But when we have this superficial information, what happened with the key topics that we need to discuss in order to solve the conflicts? When we're talking about the dispossession of land, right? Because generations of indigenous people that have been living for years in a specific area, because they were never incentivized to sign a paper saying that that area, that land belongs to them through administrator approach. Basically, that land was assigned to a different family, to a different people. They had to be displaced. So that kind of problems that are at the root of the conflict is not presented in most of the media, right? So, and also when we're talking about extractive companies that are damaging the environment, or the violation of rights, fundamental rights in different communities, or those gangs, those bad crimes that we call there in Colombia, bandas criminales, criminal gangs that sometimes have close relationship with politicals in regions. You know, most of the paramilitaries, at some point there in Colombia, they signed this famous agreement in which politicians, important people in different regions signed the agreement that they were committed to support and to, in a certain way, work with those paramilitary groups. So that kind of information that is key sometimes is absent, is not present in most of the news media, in most of the newscasts, especially in mainstream media. It is possible to find that information in portals such as Verdad Abierta, such as Quién y Qué, but those are not mainstream media, those are not the ones that are consumed the most in Colombia, right? For instance, this idea about the official voice, the elite. There is a lot of studies that said that most of the time, the official version of the conflict was the unique version in most of the newspaper. And I recall something special that happened at some point when Uribe decided to use a specific language to point out the guerrilla. They were called killer, they were called narco terrorists, and all the generals that when they have to talk about, they have to use the same term. So what happened was that at some point, that changed in regard to news media, and most of the newspapers, most of the radio stations, the journalists innocently start repeating the same way that those actors of the conflict were called, narco-terroristas. So what happened is that there was not any criticism about, okay, there is a elite official government version of the reality that we need to perhaps step down to analyze and to try to explore if there is no other way to contribute to this problem that we have there, right? And also, this idea to better contextualize the information, to really provide in-depth information, to use genres, main genres, the main genres of journalism, chronicle. So according to what we call the sociological of news production, it's not common in particular in mainstream media. When we watch, for instance, the most important newscast, television newscast, Caracol, at 7 p.m. In the afternoon there in Colombia. So the newscasts, in average, a news is 60 seconds, 1 minute, maximum 2 minutes. So this kind of information that people are exposed is without any contextualization about so many problems that we're facing there, right? So as I mentioned, yes, it is possible to find good information, but sometimes it's not like in the mainstream media. It's more like a specific outlets. And sometimes happens that for people to have access to the internet, especially in certain rural areas or in strata 1 and strata 2, you are not going to pay for a service that sometimes is expensive. So in order to, for instance, to visit those pages, to read information really deep, sometimes to have access is really complicated. So it's also problematic. And sometimes when we talk to journalists, they say, I would like to prefer, have to provide more information. I prefer like to do a really profound job. So we can identify certain features that align with peace journalism. But what happened? This is more like a personal interest, but clashes with more like a general interest, because many of the owners of those newspapers, many of the owners of those news systems, they are not interested like in provide this kind of information. They want more that superficial information, because sometimes when you recognize the problem, you need to solve it. And in order to solve it, you need to negotiate. And if you are in a position of power, you don't want to negotiate, because you are the one that can benefit with the system as it is right now. So basically, those are some of the findings that I would like to share this afternoon with you guys. And of course, this is not just the only phase. There are many journalists, in particular in those websites, that are working really hard, that are facing all kinds of problems, that are trying to present the information that sometimes is not, don't have a chance to be presented in mainstream media. But still, in order for them to reach a huge audience, like the mainstream media is really hard and really complicated. So thank you so much for your attention.